1948. For Palestinians, that year is Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. When hundreds of thousands were forced out of their homes. For Israelis, that year marks the creation of the State of Israel. As a filmmaker and as a Palestinian, this documentary series was my way to understand the events of the past that are still shaping the present.
On April the 19th, 1936, the Palestinians launched a national strike to protest against mass Jewish immigration and what they saw as Britain's alliance with the Zionist movement. The British responded with force. During the 6 months of the strike, over 190 Palestinians were killed and more than 800 wounded. Wary of popular revolt, Arab leaders advised the Palestinians to end the strike.
والمؤسف إنه البيان لما طلع الأمير عبد الله موقع عليه وملك اليمن الإمام وناشدوا أهل فلسطين إنه فوقوا الإضراب يا أخي والأمور بنحلها مع الحليفة والحليفة نواها طيبة وكذا.
وإعطاء بريطانيا فرصة حتى تثبت حسن نواياها، حسن نوايا بين قوسين. ومن المؤسف أنه حتى الآن نتحدث عن قرارات الأمم المتحدة وعن مشاريع أمريكية وأوروبية ونقول فلنعطي الغرب فرصة لإثبات حسن نوايا، كأنه 70 سنة ليست كافية لإقناعنا بأنه ليس هناك حسن نوايا من الغرب.
Palestinian leaders bowed to pressure from the Arab heads of state and agreed to meet the British Royal Commission of Inquiry, headed by Lord Peel. In its report of July 1937, the Peel Commission recommended the partition of Palestine. The report drew the frontiers of a Jewish state in 1/3 of Palestine and an Arab state in the remaining 2/3 to be merged with Transjordan. A corridor of land from Jerusalem to Jaffa would remain under British mandate. The Commission also recommended transferring, where necessary, Palestinians from the lands allocated to the new Jewish state. The Commission's proposals were widely published and provoked heated debate.
يصر الصهيونيين من تقرير بيل كوميشن كل السرور لأنه مضمون في التقرير فكرة ترانسفير، أي انتقال الشعوب من منطقة أخرى خلال عقيدتهم أو قوميتهم. فبالنسبة إلى الصهيونيين معنى الترانسفير يعني قد يوصلوا على دولة يهودية 100% مع حق وبرميشن الدولة المنتدب. فذلك كان يعني أحسن شيء في تقرير بيل كوميشن بالنسبة إلى الحركة الصهيونية.
تنظيف وتطهير فلسطين من سكانها العرب من وجهة النظر الصهيونية عملية تم التخطيط لها عشرات السنين قبل. وجود لجنة تسمى بلجنة الترانسفير التي كان يرأسها يوسف فايتس الذي كان يشكل الساعد الأيمن لبن غوريون، وهذا في سنوات الثلاثين. طبعا هذا يؤكد أن المخطط الصهيوني كان يدرس مسبقا ضرورة التخطيط المنهجي لتطهير هذه البلاد من العرب خدمة للفكر الصهيوني، لكي يتسنى ترويج فكرة أرض بدون سكان لسكان بدون أرض.
From the 1930s, especially from the late 1930s onwards, they did start to discuss it very intensively, but still secretly. So I think it wasn't possible for many Palestinians to know what we know today as historians, because it was in the archives.
كان في جهاز تصنت، يعني اليهود في الثلاثينات، هذا إشي أنا استغربت جدا. يعني المكالمات حاجة من الحسيني من مكتبه كان في تصنت اليهود، وكانوا يسجلوا كل اللي بيحكي، وهيك كانوا يعرفوا كمان إذا في يهود بيحكوا مع جماعة حاج أمين، وكانوا يروحوا لعندهم ويحكوا لهم أنتوا بتغلطوا، حتى ما حكوا أشياء أسرار، يعني ما كشفوا أسرار.
As the Palestinian revolt continued, Britain's response hardened. Between 1936 and 1937, the British killed over 1,000 Palestinians. 37 British military police and 69 Jews also died. In September 1937, Britain declared martial law and disbanded the main Palestinian political organ, the Arab Higher Committee, headed by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. 5 of its members were exiled to the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean, a remote British colony. One of these was the mayor of Jerusalem, Hussein al-Khalidi. Outcast in the Seychelles, he wrote a diary condemning British policy and its support for Zionism. In October 1937, fearing imprisonment, Haj Amin al-Husseini and other Palestinian leaders fled to Lebanon. The political leadership of the Palestinians was now in exile. A school textbook from this period shows what Palestinian school children were learning. The book defines Palestine as bordering Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and the Mediterranean Sea. Within 10 years, all this was to change. The revolt continued despite the absence of the Palestinian leadership. To crush the protests, Britain sent in reinforcements.
بريطانيا جندت من أجل أن تكسر هذه الثورة، يعني كانت جندت يعني أشهر جنرالاتها، الجنرال ويفل، الجنرال ديل، الجنرال ماكميلان، الجنرال ريش، 4 جنرالات، واشتركوا في الحرب العالمية الأولى، يعني خبرات عسكرية كبيرة جدا.
British troops spared no effort in seeking to disarm the Palestinians. This included widespread searches for weapons.
إذا وصلوا لقوا رصاصة فاضي باب بيتنا ينسوا في البيت.
كانت بريطانيا تمنع أي واحد يحمل سلاح، حتى لو فشخ يحاكموا عليها، ممنوع. يعني في البلد في 3-4 برانق فيش.
يجوا عنا تفتيش يفتشوا
يحطوا يكبوا الطحين على القمح على الظلة مع العدس يخربطوا الدار ويطلعوا يطلعونا احنا عند المدرسة يصيروا يحكوا كلام عاطل الانجليز يفتشوا البلد ويروحوا ونرجع الدار بهدلونا الله يبهدلهم.
نقول دوا على الانجليز كيف كانوا يجوا ياخذوا النسوان يحطوهم، تاخذني امي على الجامع ياخذوهم يحطوهم في الجامع ويفوتوا يفتشوا البيوت على الرجال يدوروا على الرجال ويقولوا غيمت بس يجي الانجليز بالدبابات وبالكذب يعني والطيارات يهربوا الرجال لانه بدهم يدوروا على رجال الثوره.
بدي احكي لك الحكايه. اجى العيد لبسنا أواعينا وطلعنا من نروح على الجامعة نصلي، ما حسينا للطيارات إلا الجيش دخل. لما أخذونا قعدونا فتحوا في كراجات محلات وقالوا كمون بهالسنقات وفلينا عبونا في المحلات كلياتها سكروا علينا. فيش لا شرب ولا شيء صرنا مبول على حالنا.
الرد فعل بالنسبة للسلطة البريطانية كان عنيف جدا. كونوا في عند concentration camps في فلسطين وأخذوا آلاف من المواطنين الفلسطينيين وحطوهم في هذول المخيمات للconcentration camps وفي نفس
الاعتقالات. نعم
اعتقالات.
Among those arrested by the British was Savaj Nassar, wife of the newspaper editor Najib Nassar. Arrested without charge, she spent 11 months in prison before being released. As the death toll rose during the revolt, the Palestinian press captured the mood of its community. This cartoon provides an example. It depicts the leaders of the Zionist movement building their state on a foundation of human skulls. While the British authorities disarmed the Palestinians, they armed and equipped special Jewish forces to ostensibly act as a protective militia for Jewish settlements. The Palestinians saw this as further evidence of British bias and injustice. In 1938, an underground Zionist paramilitary organization called Irgun began to increase the number of attacks against Arab targets. In July of that year, the group carried out a succession of bombings in civilian areas in Haifa and Jerusalem. 68 Palestinians were killed.
لا أتصور الصهيونية بدون عنف، سواء قبل قيام دولة إسرائيل أو بعد قيام دولة إسرائيل.
In some cases, British officers were actively engaged in training Jewish paramilitaries. A Jewish paramilitary force called Haganah was trained by Ord Wingate, a British officer and ardent supporter of Zionism.
Ord Wingate was very racist towards the Arabs. During his role as a British army officer in the Arab revolt, that he decided to append to his units Jewish soldiers, and he taught them how to occupy Palestinian villages, expel them, destroy them, and I think in many ways he contributed directly to the ideas of ethnic cleansing that would be perpetrated on the ground in 1948.
Each volunteers plus 3 officers.
In 1976, BBC ran a TV series about Wingate's life, containing a scene on his activities in Palestine.
Using a combined force of British and Jewish personnel. British soldiers and Haganah men will assemble at 1900 hours, 15th of May, 1938.
Moshe Dayan, later Israel's defense minister, looked up to Orde Wingate as a mentor. Wingate organized special night raids of armed Haganah and British volunteers against Palestinian villages suspected of harboring revolutionaries.
وصلت الثورة الفلسطينية إلى قمتها في صيف 1938 وكانت هناك قيادات ميدانية كبيرة جدا.
هناك تقريبا 65 قائد محلي و 14 قائد منطقة، فتقريبا من 60 إلى 70% من هؤلاء القادة كانوا من القساميين.
مثلا في الجليل الأعلى كان هناك القائد خليل القائد القسامي الذي اشترك في معركة يعبد مع الشيخ القسام خليل عيسى أو إبراهيم الكبير منطقة الجليل الأعلى. عمل المنطقة الثانية كانت منطقة الجليل الأدنى أو الجليل الأسفل، وكان أيضا فيها بقود هذه المنطقة قائد قسامي. لذلك أنا قلت لك الثورة هي كانت ابتدأت ثورة القسام، أبو إبراهيم الصغير اللي هو توفيق لإبراهيم.
The Palestinian resistance leader in the Jenin area was Farhan al-Saadi. The Nablus region was commanded by Mohammed Salah al-Hamad, who was killed in May 1938. Abdel Fattah Mustafa took over command. In Jerusalem, the Palestinian commander was Abdel Qadir al-Husseini. In Jaffa, Hassan Salama. By 1938, the Palestinians were beginning to form into more coordinated groups in their uprising against British occupation and Jewish immigration. The commander-in-chief of the revolutionaries was Abdul Rahim al-Haj Mohammed.
لاحق الإنجليز الوالد ووضعوا جوائز لمن يلقي القبض عليه أو يأتي به، والحمد لله تمكن من التخفي والهرب، وبدأوا يشكلوا فصائل فلسطينية للجهاد، واستمرت هذه الفصائل تعتمد على نفسها وتعتمد على القرى. وأذكر عندما جاء الإنجليز جاءوا ونسفوا بيتنا، كنا نيام، فأيقظونا وأخرجونا من البيت ونسفوا البيت على ما فيه. الوالد بعث رسالة إلى الحج أمين في تاريخ 18/3/1939 ويشير إلى الحج أمين بأنه بعض الثوار جاءوا إلى دمشق ويصرف عليهم على الملابس وعلى أشياء لا تهم الثورة كثيرا، ويجب أن توجه فلوس الثورة إلى الرصاص والبنادق.
In the last line of his letter, Abdul Rahim al-Haj Mohammed warned that if the Palestinian political leadership did not toughen its stance, then the revolution would be defeated. A few days later, Abdul Rahim was killed in an ambush set up by the British in the village of Sanur. Abdul Rahim left behind him 4 sons.
قضية حصار القائد عبد الرحيم الحج محمد وسقوطه في صانور في آذار 1939، هذا الملف ما زال مغلقا في الأرشيفات البريطانية وفي الأرشيفات الإسرائيلية.
والجهد بالنفس أقصى غاية الجهد، الشباب المجاهدين اللي ناضلوا واستشهدوا هذولا قمة الأمة، هم خير العناصر في الأمة على الإطلاق، لا أحد يدنو إلى أقدامهم، لكن لم يجدوا القيادات التي ترعاهم. تنظيم والتخطيط فقدناه من الأصل.
القيادات كانت دون مستوى وعي المرحلة الحقيقة.
Between 1938 and 1939, the British held dozens of military tribunals. 112 Palestinians were executed. Among them, Farhan al-Saadi, the 80-year-old revolutionary from Jenin, executed during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan.
وصاروا مثل يا خال، وصاروا مثل يا خال، طول وعرض البلاد.
اهتمام شديد كان عند البريطانيين بالأمن ويسجلون هنا جميع الشخصيات الوطنية، إنه هذا شخص مشاغب وهو غير محب للسلام ولأنه يحرض الناس.
One such Palestinian patriot or troublemaker was the Greek Catholic Bishop of Acre, Gregoras Hajar. He had warned against the Jews wishing to take over Palestine. Bishop Hajar is known as the Bishop of the Arabs. In 1940, he was killed in a car crash on the way to Haifa. Local police reports suggested it was not an accident. Today, he is held in esteem by both Christian and Muslim Palestinians.
بريطانيا كانت تمارس إلى ذلك ضغط هائل على السكان من سياسة العقاب الجماعي، حرق البيادر وتجميع الرجال وإجبارهم بالسير على الجمر وعلى ألواح الصبر والتعذيب وخلط المواد الغذائية وبعضها خلط الزيت بالسكر وما إلى ذلك، والتجويع وهدم المنازل والحصار الشديد في أيام الحرب القائضة. كل هذه الأمور مجتمعة أثرت على معنويات الشعب الفلسطيني وقدرته على الاستمرار بالثورة، خاصة الكثير من كوادر الثورة تم القضاء عليها.
In addition to the targeting of its leaders, the revolution was also infiltrated.
صاروا اليهود يشتغلوا مع المخابرات البريطانية. مرات مثلا كان واحد يهودي يجي عنده صاحب عربي بيجيب معلومات، اليهودي بيتصل على الجيش البريطاني وبيروحوا مع بعض يسوي اعتقالات في، عشان اليهود طبعا ما لهمش دولة وما لهمش جيش حقيقي، يسوي اعتقالات في بلد معين. هذا صار كتير. وكمان كان عشان علاقتهم كانت كويسة مع البريطانيين، اليهود مثلا إذا كان بدهم يسووا واحد من الثوار يجندوه كعميل كانوا يتصلوا بالبريطانيين يقولوا هذا الشخص ممكن يشتغل معنا، هو في السجن، فلتوا عنه خلوه يطلع ويشتغل معنا. وأسسوا نوادي المسلمة الوطنية، وكانت تدعم من قبل الصهاينة، وهم حكوا ضد الحركة الوطنية. مثلا لما راحوا وفود الحركة الوطنية للندن هم كانوا يبعثوا بركيات ضد هدول الوفود ما تمثلنا والى اخره.
يعني الصهيونية كانت تأسس نوادي اسمها إسلامية
وطنية، مش بس إسلامية وطنية، وتدعمها
سرا يعني
بصير. وكانوا يقعدوا مع بعض اليهود وهدول الجماعة من هدول النوادي وبكتبوا بركيات للمندوب السامي وللوزير الخارجية البريطاني.
The Palestinian revolt lasted from 1936 to 1939. In that period, an estimated 5,000 Palestinians were killed and 14,000 wounded. Some 100 British soldiers and 400 Jews also died during the revolt.
واحد من كل 10 شاب فلسطيني من هذا الأمر اللي يعمل الحرب، يعني بين ال 18 وبين ال 40، أم في السجن، أم مقتول، أم مجروح، أم مطرود من البلد. ففعلا كل الجيل الذي قد يكون جيش لمقاومة الحركة اليهودية في الأربعينات كان مفقود.
اللي كان نشيط بالثورة أو انقتل أو هرب أو انعدم، يعني وما كان في أي مؤسسات تقريبا يعني بالمجتمع الفلسطيني، لا مؤسسات ولا نشيطين ولا شيء. يعني كان المجتمع بوضع كتير متدهور يعني.
The Palestinian society was leaderless in many ways, both militarily and politically. And although there was a Palestinian leadership in exile, it had very loose connection to the events inside Palestine. So I think it is fair to say that from 1939 onwards, there isn't a real Palestinian leadership on the ground. And this is one of the reasons that contributed to what happened in 1948.
The battle for Palestine was lost by the Palestinians not in 1948, but in the late 1930s because Britain completely smashed to the ground the Arab revolt and the Arab irregular forces.
In 1939, Britain held a conference at St James's Palace in London to discuss the partition of Palestine. The Arab and Jewish delegations refused to sit at the same table.
تلاقي الوفد الفلسطيني محضون بالوفد الأردني والمصري واليمني والعراقي. بنفس الوقت بتلاقي نفس القاعة وبنفس الجلسة بتلاقي الوفد الصهيوني اليهودي بن غوريون ووايزمان وشاريت ومحضون بملوك اليهود الأغنياء في العالم. يعني عدنا لنتفاوض مع الحاكم الشريك مع العدو الحقيقي لما تبقى لك من حقوق.
After 5 weeks of talks, the conference failed in delivering the goal of bringing peace to Palestine. Later that year, the world was again at war. Soon, after the outbreak of World War II, Jews in Palestine were permitted to enlist in the British Army. Fighters from the Haganah paramilitary group were trained by the British. They would later form the core of the Israeli army.
ضمن خطط الحقيقة دخلوا معه شكلوا بعض كتائب أو بعض وحدات أو كذا إلى آخره من اليهود، وكثير من قادة اليهود اللي قادوا الحرب في 48 ولا يزال بعضهم كمان لا يزال بيجوز بعضهم أحياء منهم اللي اشتغلوا في الجيش البريطاني كمان في هذيك الفترة.
وهذا على فكرة أثر في 48 عشان كان في كتير آلاف من اليهود منظمين ومجندين وبيعرفوا يستعملوا سلاح ومنهم ضباط ومنهم بيعرفوا بالمدافع يعني وكل وباللاسلكي وبكل كل الأشياء وكل إنه الجيش مهني لازم يعرف إشي ما كان موجود بالطرف الفلسطيني طبعا.
لا شك أن الخبرة التي استفادت الجندي اليهودي من خلال الحرب العالمية الثانية استفاد كثير خلال حرب فلسطين في الأربعينات. رأينا في فلسطين جنود يهودي لهم خبرة واسعة في استعمال الإسلحات وفي كل المجالات، حتى في الطيران في الدبابات وفي السلاح البسيط التي يحمل الجندي العادي، فكان لهم كل الخبرة. وبعدين في العلوم العسكرية يوجد ضباط يهودية اللي وصلوا إلى هذه الدرجة تحت الجيش البريطاني.
As war engulfed the world, in Palestine, according to Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, Jewish groups initiated an intriguing intelligence-gathering operation.
The first stage was the collection of material about every village in Palestine. This was called the Village Files project. They were quite amazing because they had information of every village in Palestine, mainly about the details of how good actually would be to take it over. So there's a lot of information about the quality of the land, how rich the people were, to the extent that they even knew how many fruit are on each tree, there is on each tree. What were the political affiliation of people, how easy or how difficult it would be to occupy it. So
they started gathering in the 30s? Or?
In the late 30s,
yeah.
In the late 30s and early 1940s, yes. They were actually exploiting Arab hospitality, because if you come to a village in Palestine, it doesn't matter who you are, you're invited. And they used that hospitality in order to spy around. And especially what they needed were two things. One is to know how to access the village later on in order to occupy it, and to know what the village had in terms of assets and so on, that when they occupied that people would not, run away with what the Zionists wanted for themselves.
Zionists were keen to increase the number of Jews coming to Palestine. But following the St. James Conference in 1939, the British imposed limitations on Jewish immigration. This change in British policy was met with opposition. In 1940, a French-built ocean liner, Patria, was at Haifa harbor carrying 1,800 Jewish refugees who had earlier arrived from Nazi-occupied Europe. The British were deporting them to Mauritius. To prevent this, the Haganah group planted a bomb on board to disable the ship. A large hole was blown into the side of the ship, and some 260 people on board died when the boat sank. Details of this operation were disclosed 17 years later by the Haganah member who had planted the bomb. The British were struggling to contain the situation in Palestine. Meanwhile, in New York in May 1942, an important meeting took place at the Biltmore Hotel. Some 600 prominent American delegates and Zionist leaders attended. The meeting was prompted by the realization that America, not Britain, would henceforth play a part in the fulfillment of Zionist designs. Attendees included David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, and Chaim Weissman, president of the Zionist organization.
في ذلك المؤتمر المنظمة الصهيونية اتخذت قراراً بنقل الثقل من بريطانيا إلى أمريكا. طبعاً كان ممهد لذلك علاقات قوية بين الصهيونيين في أمريكا وبين الحزبين الديمقراطي والجمهوري، وحتى الآن العلاقة قوية. لكن تطورت العلاقة. خروج أمريكا من الحرب العالمية الثانية سيدة العالم الغربي، ونزول بريطانيا إلى إمبراطورية سابقة حيث كانت الشمس لا تغيب عنها وأصبحت تغيب عنها تماما، وبالأساس تغيب عن لندن الشمس. ذلك شجع اليهود على أن يعتمدوا على أمريكا من خلال استمالة الزعامات والقيادات الأمريكية من الحزبين عن طريق رأس المال والدعاية الصهيونية في أمريكا.
The Biltmore Declaration outlined support for what it called the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth in all of Palestine. It condemned Britain's limits on Jewish immigration. Other Americans raised concerns about the Zionist program. In 1943, General Patrick Hurley, a former Secretary of War, submitted a report to President Roosevelt, following a visit to Palestine and a meeting with Ben-Gurion in Jerusalem. In the report, Hurley was highly skeptical of the Zionist agenda. He summarized its expansionist aims. The Zionist organization in Palestine has indicated its commitment to an enlarged program for 1. A sovereign Jewish state which would embrace Palestine and probably eventually Transjordan. 2. The eventual transfer of the Arab population from Palestine to Iraq. 3. Jewish leadership for the entire Middle East in the fields of economic development and control. Zionist supporters in America were undeterred. In 1944, the World Jewish Conference met in Atlantic City, in the state of New Jersey. The speeches left little doubt about their drive to see the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine.
Jewish Commonwealth inherits Israel, operates Israel, means nothing more than justice to the Jew, freedom for the Jew, equality of the Jewish people with all the free peoples of earth.
If the real solution of the Jewish problem cannot be brought about unless the Jewish people will be given the right and will be helped by the United Nations to establish Palestine once and for all as its own Jewish commonwealth. This conference appeals to the United Nations to ensure that the general scheme of post-war reconstruction shall include the establishment of Palestine as a free and democratic Jewish commonwealth.
In 1945, following the end of World War II, US President Harry Truman appeared to encourage the Zionist agenda by recommending the 100,000 displaced Jews in Europe be allowed to emigrate to Palestine.
Always hoping that we'll finally arrive at the peace in the world which we anticipated when we created the United Nations. That's the only reason.
Back in Palestine, Britain was maintaining its new policy of limiting Jewish immigration. As a result, the different Jewish paramilitaries decided to begin coordinating attacks against the British military. The main Jewish force, the Haganah, agreed to work with the Irgun and Stern Gang. The Jewish resistance movement was formed. David Ben-Gurion persuaded members of the Jewish community in America to fund the purchase of arms manufacturing machinery so that the Haganah could produce its own weapons.
والله إنهم بالجبال منشورين وبتدربوا نضحك عليهم كل شو حركة بودينا مش بيسووا هذول ليش هذول بيعملوا هيك يدبوا حالهم على الشوج والله على الشوج يدبوا حالهم ويتدربوا نضحك عليهم.
Meanwhile, Palestinian politician Musa al-Alami went on a tour of the Arab world. In Arab capitals, he discovered complacency towards the situation in Palestine. The general view being that the Arabs vastly outnumbered the Jews and could control the Jewish minority. For their part, the British realized how volatile the situation had become in Palestine. They began to evacuate British families. Discussions went on between the Zionist movement and the British authorities. Documents reveal that Chaim Weizmann held secret conversations in March and July of 1946 with the British High Commissioner Alan Cunningham. In these talks, they discussed the partition of Palestine and how the parts of a viable Israeli state should be linked up, giving it control of both the Negev desert and the waters of Galilee. On the ground in Palestine, the British Army continued to confiscate arms from both sides. In the first half of 1946, over 300 Palestinians were arrested for the possession of weapons. At this time, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, was in France. He had spent the war years in Italy and Germany, hoping the Axis countries would win World War II and that their victory would herald independence for Palestine.
Der Großmufti von Jerusalem besichtigt musulmanische Truppen der deutschen Wehrmacht.
يعني حاج أمين كان يخاف إنه إذا بتصير في هون مؤسسات ويكون في هون قيادي جديد يمكن يعني ما يكون عنده تأثير زي ما كان وما يكون على منصب القيادي.
مفتي القدس الحقيقة الحاج أمين يعني نحن بنحسن النية فيه، لكن كان في قناعتي أنا الشخصية دون مستوى القيادة. لكن تنسيش البيئة العامة في البلد. الرجل كان مفتي فلسطين العام ورئيس المجلس الإسلامي الشغلات، مش أنا اللي عينته، اللي عينه الإنجليزي كمان.
In May 1946, the Mufti went to Egypt to participate in a summit meeting of Arab leaders. The newly formed Arab League's first item of agenda was to coordinate a response to the situation in Palestine. A follow-up meeting of Arab foreign ministers was held in Bludan, Syria. Present as an observer was the director of British military intelligence in the Middle East, Brigadier Iltid Clayton. Meanwhile, back in Palestine, the British Army was now the target of an increasing number of attacks from Jewish paramilitary groups.
Against British restrictions, extremists wreck a train on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Armed crewmen inspect the hole where the explosion which caused the wreck occurred, and guards patrol the area. The continued unrest...
Violence and death ride the ancient streets of Jerusalem. And here the climax, blasting of police headquarters. 3 men lost their lives in this attack. A roving band shot up the station first, then launched high explosives. Soldiers combed the debris for other dead as turmoil seethes in the cradle of brotherly love. New High Commissioner Cunningham investigates. Tommies patrol the streets and quiet descends. Is it the calm before another storm?
The King David Hotel in Jerusalem, site of the largest and most audacious attack on the British Mandate forces. The building was used by the British as their administrative and military headquarters. On July the 22nd, 1946, a huge explosion demolished the entire southwest side of the hotel. 91 people were killed. The attack was carried out by Irgun, the Jewish paramilitary group. The King David Hotel was not to be their last target. On March the 1st, 1947, Irgun blew up the British Officers' Club at Goldsmith House in Jerusalem.
Jewish terrorist gang to intimidate authority.
16 persons die and 13 others are injured as extremists blow up the Officers' Club in an unremitting campaign of violence. Universal's cameraman, on the scene minutes after the explosion, records the stunned and shaken victims as they are carried from the wreckage. Few of the 50 officer inmates of the club escaped injury as extremists, under cover of rifle fire, hurled explosive-laden suitcases through the windows and doors of the building. Several of the injured died later of their wounds. The club is a shambles, a reprisal for the deportation of Jews from Haifa.
In July 1947, Irgun kidnapped 2 British sergeants, Clifford Martin and Mervyn Pace. They were abducted as retaliation for the arrest and scheduled execution of 3 Irgun members. The British authorities carried out the executions of the 3 Jewish militants. The following day, the 2 British soldiers were found hanging in a field near Netanya.
Pictures follow the hanging of 2 British sergeants by extremists. Palestine becomes an armed camp.
Sad hanging of the 2 British Army sergeants probably accelerated the speedy exodus from Palestine of the British Mandate.
The graves of the British soldiers can still be found in a British military cemetery in Ramleh, south of Tel Aviv. Following the so-called Sergeant's Affair, British forces in Palestine went on a heightened state of alert. The leader of Irgun was Menachem Begin. The group's symbol contained the map of a Jewish state that encompassed the whole of Palestine as well as Transjordan.
25 high-ranking officials of the Irgun-Tzvai Leumi and Stern gang were arrested.
British authorities arrested Begin after distributing his photo with the slogan, "Wanted for murder." "30 years later, Begin became the Prime Minister of Israel.
Signed by President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin, and it will be
In 1978, Begin was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with Egypt's President Anwar al-Sadat. During the last 8 years of the British Mandate in Palestine, British documents recorded over 500 attacks by underground Jewish groups. These included parcel bombs sent to British officials. On January the 12th, 1947, another Jewish group, the Stern Gang, parked a truck loaded with explosives outside a British police station.
From Haifa come pictures showing the result of the recent outrage that shattered the brief lull in terrorist activity. The incident was caused by a man, believed by some to be one of the Stern Gang this time, driving a stolen van full of explosives to police headquarters where it blew up. 2 British and 2 Arab policemen were killed and others are reported missing. More than 60 police, soldiers and civilians were injured. Many of the casualties were caused by flying glass, and a great deal of damage was done, not only at police headquarters, but also in the neighborhood. Windows were broken as far as a mile away.
Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been a prominent and enthusiastic supporter of Zionism, condemned the attack. With attacks on British troops escalating, the British felt increasingly beleaguered in Palestine.
في كان مجموعة من الأسباب، منها أنه ضمن قوات الأمن أو الشرطة البريطانية بفلسطين كان أعداد كبيرة من اليهود، وهؤلاء اليهود كانوا يعرفون الخطط ويحاولون إجهاضها. الشيء الثاني كان نفوذ الحركة الصهيونية في الخارج قوي جدا على الحكومة البريطانية، ويؤثرون عليها كي تؤثر على ضباطها وعلى الانتداب البريطاني في فلسطين.
In February 1947, Britain announced the decision to end its mandate in Palestine. Its spokesman said his country would turn over the difficult situation to the United Nations.
British public opinion will permit no more expenditure of life and treasure. It will acquiesce no longer in the use of British forces and the squandering of British lives to impose a policy in Palestine which one or other of the parties is determined to resist. It has brought down on our heads the execration of the Jews and the bitter resentment of the Arabs. It has made us the butt of malicious criticism throughout the world. We have played our part.
Britain was now washing its hands of Palestine, setting in motion events that would lead towards the momentous year of 1948.